This is a reading from The Diary of Jesus by Jean Olagnier. I will now explain how I managed to date the events of Jesus' life as described by Maria Valtorta. First of all, most scenes were already in chronological order. Maria did not see them in this order, but she was directed by Jesus himself to put a certain vision after another one so that they would follow a chronological order. It would appear, though, that Jesus did not do this for every single scene. Thus, I could not afford to be unwary. The work that now lay ahead of me was to establish dates for all these scenes. To begin with, in each scene I looked for words like the day before, 5 days later, or the next Sabbath. Such words enabled me to link scenes to one another. This is rather obvious in the case of expressions like the storm on the day before, when there was a storm in the preceding scene. At this stage, I ended up with many little clusters of scenes, each containing a few scenes and spanning a few days. Since Jesus traveled a great deal, I paid special attention to names of places and phrases such as "at the same place." I then found out how far it was from one point to another and estimated how long it would take Jesus to get where he was going. I then focused on the Sabbath. Like most Jews, Jesus and his apostles rested on the Sabbath and did not travel except in case of an emergency. Footnote: from sunset on Friday until Saturday at sundown, Jews were forbidden by the Jewish laws to travel more than 3,800 feet. This helped me to determine on which days of the week Jesus did travel. As a result of this, I was able to discover on which days of the week most scenes fell. This, in turn, made it possible to link up the clusters of scenes into larger groups. At this point, I was dealing with a number of large group of scenes that spanned weeks at a time. After this, I concentrated on phrases such as "in early spring," "on this cold December day," "under the April sun," or "the second quarter of the moon of Ziv." Footnote: as you can see, Maria sometimes calls the months by their modern names, sometimes by their Hebrew names. See remarks on page 12. This calendaric and climactic data enabled me to fit the large groups of scenes into yet larger time frames that spanned as much as a few months in total. Finally, I was able to fit these long sequences of interrelated scenes exactly into the year, thanks to many lunar descriptions in the text, and particularly two very specific passages in Maria's work. See page 343, editor. All I had to do then was to determine if everything fit in with the many feasts mentioned in the visions: Passover, Pentecost, the Tabernacles, and the feast of the dedication of the temple. See page 337 for some information on these Jewish feasts, editor. In order to do this, I had to consult 5 different calendars. These included the Julian calendar, the Gregorian calendar, the modern Jewish calendar, a former Jewish calendar that was the standard in Jesus' time, and finally, an ancient Jewish calendar. See Appendix 1, which deals specifically with calendars. Many concrete examples are given to illustrate my analytical method, as well as calendar conversions. Needless to say, this involved rather complex calculations. I also had to keep in mind the relationship between these calendars and the phases of the moon. See Appendix 1. At this point, I found that everything fit almost perfectly. There are only a few events that could possibly be dated differently, but this would in no way detract from the chronology as a whole. All in all, then, I have been able to use Maria Valtorta's writings to establish a precise chronology of Jesus' public ministry. This chronology is internally consistent and is confirmed by all other historical data on the life of Christ. As a matter of fact, this was to be expected if Maria Valtorta's work tells us what really happened in Jesus' public ministry. Any text that describes any past historical reality should be filled with details that can be verified, as well as be internally consistent. From another point of view, we have an author, Maria Valtorta, who lay ill in bed. She had failed mathematics in high school. She did not know anything about calendars or Jewish feasts. How could she write thousands of pages filled with invented details that would agree perfectly with a number of calendars and Jewish feasts? To this day, even specialists have to be careful when they deal with this type of information. It is amazing that Maria's writings can be used to produce a precise chronology of Christ's public ministry. This accomplishment begs for an explanation. That is why I say that it is tangible proof for the doubting Thomases that Pope Pius XII was right when he approved Maria Valtorta's visions and said to publish them. Now, therefore, each one of us can savor her work with total trust. It is rich and overflowing with abundant spiritual content. With this in mind, the following pages must be seen for what they are. This is only a companion book. What is more important is to read Maria Valtorta's own writings in an unabridged edition. This book is only meant as a chronological guide to the way in which Jesus and the Holy Family fulfilled their divine missions. To make it easier for the reader, I have quoted the Gospel texts in their proper chronological order, and I have quoted most of them at length. These scriptures, of course, have been handed down to us from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as they were preserved, spread, and translated by the Church. Footnote. Finding a suitable translation was difficult. Some translations are not very easy to read, while others are mangled by the kind of exegesis condemned by Christ in Maria Valtorta's work. See the Italian original, Il Poema dell'Uomo Dio, Volume 10, pages 358 to 372. I finally decided to use Monsignor Knox's translation for the most part, although I have replaced these and thous by their modern English equivalents, and have made a number of other adaptations. I have made these in the very spirit of Monsignor Knox's translation, that is, to have scriptures in highly readable English. Monsignor Knox's intention is clearly expressed throughout his books, Trials of a Translator, London, New York, Sheed and Ward, 1949. If any inappropriate phrasing has resulted, I must be considered wholly responsible for that. Monsignor Knox's translation bears the imprimatur and was authorized by the hierarchy of England and Wales, the hierarchy of Scotland. The Holy Bible, a translation from the Latin Vulgate in the light of the Hebrew and Greek originals. New York, Sheed and Ward, circa 1950. 913 pages, 285 page translator. Remarks. About dates given in this book. All the dates in this chronology are given according to today's Gregorian calendar. This enables us to fit events exactly into the seasonal cycle. It does not matter that the Roman calendar used in Jesus' time was the Julian. All the dates in Appendix 1, however, are given according to the Julian calendar. I do this no matter which year is being discussed. This is because the absolute cyclical regularity of the Julian calendar makes it the ideal standard to compare various calendars with one another. 2. About the names of the months in Maria's work. Maria sometimes uses the Hebrew name for the months and sometimes the modern name. When Maria observes the weather, vegetation, or crops in her visions, she frequently ventures an opinion as to what month it is, based on these conditions. In these cases, she always uses the modern name for the month. On the other hand, when Maria quotes a character, she uses the Hebrew and modern names interchangeably. Compared with the continental climate, Palestine has shorter falls, earlier winters and springs, and longer, noticeably hotter summers. This holds especially true for the areas next to the Jordan River, since they lie below sea level. As a result, a European in Palestine would be left with the impression that it is about a month later than it is in reality. It is extremely remarkable that whenever Maria names the month in her visions, based on the observed weather conditions, she always overdates by 1 month. However, whenever she quotes a character, the date is strictly consistent with the rest of the chronology. Part 1. The Coming of the Messiah. Every Christian knows, since Matthew has told us, that there are 14 generations in all, from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the captivity in Babylon, and 14 from the captivity in Babylon to Christ. Matthew chapter 1, verse 17. Chapter 1. The Holy Family and its political environment. Footnote. In part 1 of this book, the author reports many events which Maria Valtorta does not describe or only mentions incidentally. These passages, indicated by an asterisk, are included in order to give a fuller historical background to the lives of the Holy Family. Translator. Idumea is the territory that lay south and southwest of Judea. Many events took place during the 18 centuries that separated the founder of the Hebrew people and its Messiah. There were many ups and downs. One of the low points was the Roman invasion of Palestine in the year 691 of Rome, 63 BC. It was going to be another 58 years before the Son of God took flesh in our human form by the action of the Holy Spirit, 63 BC. The Roman army definitely overcame Mithridates and took over Asia Minor, after which it invaded Palestine and captured Jerusalem. Hyrcanus II was the king and high priest of the Jewish people at this time. He was the 37-year-old great-grandson of Simon Maccabeus, a descendant of Eleazar, son of Aaron. Joachim, Mary's future father, was about 14 years old at this time. He was a descendant of David. His future wife, Anne, who was about 5 years of age, descended from Aaron, just like Hyrcanus. 60 BC. The Romans subdued Israel, instituting a new regime which would last for a long time. Joachim and Anne were the only relatives of the Holy Family to have known anything other than Roman occupation. At this time, the Romans still had a great deal to conquer before they could control the whole Mediterranean basin. Therefore, they allowed Hyrcanus to rule his people. Hyrcanus, a weak and indecisive monarch, chose Antipater, an Idumean. Footnote: Idumea is the territory that lay south and southwest of Judea, as his prime minister. He delegated most of his powers to him, and Antipater established himself in Jerusalem. 59 BC. Antipater arranged to have his 15-year-old son appointed governor of Galilee. This boy turned out to be much more famous than his father. His name was Herod the Great. The political climate of Palestine was relatively calm for about 20 years. Some of the main relatives of the Holy Family were born during this time. 56 BC approximately. John the Baptist's father, Zechariah, was born at this time. He was a descendant of Abiah. Abiah has also been spelled Abiah, Abiah with an ending in H, Abijah, or Abijah ending in H. Editor. Who descended from Aaron. He was a descendant of Abiah, who descended from Aaron, who in turn descended from Levi. Alphaeus was born shortly afterwards. Also known as Clopas, he was descended from David. He was Joseph's older brother. 53 BC. Various intrigues began to happen at the royal court. For instance, since Hyrcanus distrusted his nephew Antigonus, he had him imprisoned in Rome. At this time, John the Baptist's mother, Elizabeth, was born. She was Anne's cousin. 52 BC. Herod was ambitious and talented. At the age of 22, he managed to become a friend of Antony, who was, at the time, a general under Julius Caesar. 51 BC. Herod was a regular at Rome. He maintained a relationship with Cicero, the Roman orator, writer, and statesman, from 106 to 43 BC. A few years went by. 42 BC. Antigonus escaped. 41 BC. Antigonus inspired and supported a Parthian attack against his uncle Hyrcanus' kingdom. Meanwhile, Phasael, Herod's older brother, was imprisoned. 40 BC. Herod failed to obtain the help of Egypt to combat Antigonus. Herod then left for Rome to ask his friend Antony for help. By then, Antony was a triumvir, that is, one of the three men who wielded the greatest amount of power in the last stages of the Roman Republic. Since Antigonus had just become a traitor and Hyrcanus was incompetent, Herod thought that the time was ripe for a great blow, and events proved him right. Antony agreed with him and immediately proclaimed him king of the Jews, even though Herod was not Jewish. Antony provided him with 2 legions of soldiers to drive away the Parthians and consolidate his power in Palestine. This is due to the fact that various members of Hyrcanus' family were furious at being given a non-Jewish ruler. Antigonus, meanwhile, laid siege to Masada, where Herod's relatives had taken refuge. Herod freed Masada and brought his family back to Samaria. He then began to regain the various provinces of his kingdom. 39 or 38 BC. While Herod was busy establishing his power, Joseph was born. He was Alphaeus' brother and eventually became Mary's spouse. Mary of Clopas, the future wife of Alphaeus, was also born at this time. 37 BC. Herod further consolidated his position by capturing Jerusalem after a 5-month siege. Afterwards, he seldom left Jerusalem until shortly before he died in 3 BC. Concerning Herod's death, see page 33. We are now on page 17. Herod had a sister called Salome. Since she was extremely jealous, she would prove to be Herod's hell on earth. This is how it all began. 30 BC. Salome knew that Herod was paranoid about plots against him, so she planted thoughts of mistrust against his own wife, Mariamne. She convinced him that Mariamne was planning to poison him. He was so overwhelmed by his paranoia that he condemned her to be stoned. When he returned to his senses, he felt deep remorse for condemning her, since he dearly loved her. In order to overcome his grief, he began to perform huge public works. 22 BC. For this reason he founded Caesarea, a seaport town built from scratch. By then, Herod's power was firmly established over the Jewish kingdom of Palestine. He had finally struck a modus vivendi with the temple. Jewish order was indeed based on strict respect for the law, and this perfectly suited Herod. Thus, he did not have to worry about public affairs too much. He needed this desperately, since his private life was, as we have seen, far from peaceful. Now Joachim and Anne went up to the temple in Jerusalem for the Feast of Tabernacles, which took place from September 24th to October 2nd that year. These dates are given in the Gregorian calendar, as are all dates in the main body of the text. See the first remark on page 12, editor. Since they were still childless after many years of marriage, they decided to imitate a number of sterile patriarch couples. They asked the Lord for a child, even though Anne was already 46 years old. They vowed to consecrate this child to the Lord if he heard their prayer. The Holy Spirit miraculously overcame Joachim and Anne's sterility. Their child was to be Mary. Furthermore, Mary was immaculately conceived. That is, she was free of any trace of hereditary original sin. 21 BC, September the 10th, a Wednesday. Mary was born 9 months after the Feast of Lights. She was born late in the evening, after an unforgettable summer storm. Then the full moon shone brightly, and a beautiful star appeared. Footnote: the full moon was 2 to 3 days ahead of time, Maria Valtorta says. Calculations bear this out. 21 BC, late November. Mary's parents went to the temple for Anne's purification. This was 80 days after Mary's birth. At the same time, they consecrated Mary to the Lord to fulfill their vow. This vow required them, according to the law, to bring Mary to the temple when she turned 3 years old. 20 BC, approximately. Meanwhile, Alphaeus' oldest son was born in Nazareth. He was called Joseph after his uncle and was about Mary's age. 18 BC. When the time came, Joachim and Anne fulfilled their vow, even though it rent their hearts. They entrusted Mary to the high priest so that she would be brought up in the temple. They never saw their daughter again. A few years later, they died in God's peace. Thus, Mary joined the group of young virgins consecrated to the Lord. Meanwhile, Herod was still busy with all his construction projects in order to forget his gloomy, painful memories. He had been rebuilding the temple 2 years earlier, that is, in 20 BC. This meant that Mary would be brought up with her peers in the vicinity of a gigantic construction site consecrated to God. This enthralled her pure soul. Meanwhile, Herod's family did not improve. On the contrary, the gloomy king was becoming more and more tangled up in a web of suspicions and mental tortures. His sister Salome was increasingly choking with rage. She had been wanting to carve out a suitable social position for her daughter, Berenice, born in 32 BC. She managed to drive away the 3 sons Herod had with Mariamne with the excuse that they should be educated in Rome. And actually, the youngest one died there in rather mysterious circumstances. Early 16 BC, Salome changed her strategy, persuaded Herod to call his 2 other sons back. These were Alexander, 18 years old, and Aristobulus, a 17-year-old simpleton. Using that simpleton to ensure power to both herself and Berenice, Salome arranged the marriage between him and her 16-year-old daughter. Late 16 BC to 13 BC, Berenice had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. 14 BC, Simon the son of Alphaeus was born. 13 BC, again Salome's morbid jealousy flared up against Herod's 2 sons, even though one of them was her son-in-law. This time she persuaded Herod that they wanted to poison him. Augustus, who had been emperor of Rome since 27 BC, was not convinced and compelled Herod to reconcile with his sons. Things became very restless after this at the king's court. 10 BC. Mary was 11 years old when work on the outside of the temple was inaugurated. She most likely attended this ceremony with her peers. 9 BC. Mary announced that she decided to consecrate her virginity to God. She was not even 12 years of age. Joseph's 3rd nephew, James, was born about this time. He was going to be the bishop of Jerusalem under the name of James the Less. 8 BC. In this year, Jude, James's brother and future apostle, was born. At this point, an extraordinary sequence of seemingly unrelated events was set into motion. 4 years later, it would result in the massacre of the innocent children of Bethlehem. This was the year 746 of Rome. A great census was going to be taken of all the nations of the Roman Empire. This is referred to in the tablets of Ankara. The census would require all residents of Palestine to report to their ancestral hometown. Since this would involve massive crowd movements, and Herod was more and more afraid of potentially dangerous events, he did not want the census to take place. He went to Rome and obtained a 2-year moratorium. 7 BC, September. Mary turned 14. Now that she had been brought up at the temple, the law required that a husband be found for her. He had to be of the same descent, that is, of the royal line of David. Furthermore, Mary happened to be an orphan. Her parents died, as we saw earlier, a few years after she entered the temple. Her official wedding had to be celebrated at the temple by Matthias, the high priest. 7 BC, December 16th to 23rd. Late in the week, on the last day of the feast of the dedication of the temple, many suitors were summoned to the temple. Each one was a son of David, and had to bring a tree bough. Joseph picked one from an almond tree in Mary's parents' garden in Nazareth. Since Joseph's was the only one already in bloom, he was pointed out as the one God had chosen. Joseph was introduced to Mary. At first they were both uneasy until they realized they both had decided to consecrate themselves to God. Joseph had decided to become a Nazirite. Footnote: the book of Numbers, chapter 6, explains that to be a Nazirite meant to make a special type of vow to God. For the duration of his vow, the Nazirite would abstain from wine and strong drink, verse 3, would let his hair grow free, verse 5, and would not go near a corpse, verse 6. To these conditions, Joseph added the vow of chastity, as he told Mary he did not wish to get married and never expected to be chosen to be Mary's spouse. Editor. They at once conferred one another's vows of chastity. Joseph promised Mary he would come to get her as soon as possible. First, he wanted to repair her parents' home so that she could live there. 6 BC, second half of February. Joseph returned when the rosebush by the south wall of Mary's house was already in bloom. Zechariah and Elizabeth came to Jerusalem at this time. We should remember that Zechariah was a priest. He spent 2 weeks a year serving with his division at the temple. This made it easy for him and his wife Elizabeth to keep in touch with their young cousin. See the Quran, Surah 3, verse 32. This verse, unexpectedly enough, agrees with the revelations given to Maria Valtorta. The high priest performed the official celebration called for by the law. The marriage contract was signed, and the newlyweds left for Nazareth by carriage with their older cousins. Alphaeus, his wife Mary, and their children were waiting for them. Other relatives and friends were there too, including Sarah and her son Alphaeus. This Alphaeus was 5 years older than Mary, and used to play with her before she left for the temple. Now it was the custom that a family wedding follow the official ceremony. Alphaeus asked Joseph then when that would be. When Mary turns 16, he replied, after the Feast of Tabernacles. Thus, in October of 5 BC. Meanwhile, Mary would settle in her parents' house, and Joseph live in his own. Zechariah and Elizabeth went back to Hebron. Shortly after this, the census was scheduled to begin, probably in Judea. Other parts of the kingdom were to be enumerated later so as to stagger the crowd movements over time. Since most Pharisees were large landowners, they frowned upon the idea that their servants should have to travel. The Pharisees were usually quite particular when it came to their rights, and they began to protest against the census. They were successful, and the census was stopped during the summer. Emperor Augustus was furious and dismissed Saturninus from his functions. Saturninus was the legate of Syria, responsible for the census. Augustus hurriedly appointed Varus in his place. 6 BC, Fall. Now a strange event happened to Zechariah. According to St. Luke's Gospel, Luke chapter 1, 5a, there was a priest called Zechariah who belonged to Abiah's section. Zechariah belonged to the 8th division of priests, which was Abiah's. Now David had divided Aaron's descendants into 24 divisions, or courses, to perform priestly duties. Eleazar's descendants were divided into 16 courses, and Itamar's 8 courses. Each division took turns serving at the temple for 1 week at a time. Shift changes occurred on Saturdays, that is, on the Sabbath, since priests had little to do on that day. Now in 6 BC, Abiah's course, which descended from Eleazar, served in April and in late September. Luke chapter 1, 5b. Zechariah had married a woman from Aaron's family by the name of Elizabeth. They were both well approved in God's sight, following all the commandments and observances of the Lord without reproach. They had no child. Elizabeth was barren, and both were now well advanced in years. He then, as it happened, was doing a priest's duty before God in the order of his term of office. Zechariah had been chosen by lot, as was the custom among the priests, to go into the sanctuary of the Lord and burn incense there, while the whole crowd of people stood praying outside at the hour of sacrifice. Crowds filled the temple courts only during feasts, and the only feast that could fall in late September was the Feast of Tabernacles. It always took place from Tishri 15 to 22. In 6 BC, this took place from Wednesday, September 27th, to Wednesday, October 4th, according to our Gregorian calendar. Zechariah served from Saturday, September 30th, to Saturday, October 7th. Therefore, Zechariah must have officiated between October 1st and October 4th. Luke chapter 1, verse 11. Suddenly he saw an angel of the Lord standing at the right of the altar where incense was burnt. Zechariah was bewildered at the sight and overcome with fear. But the angel said, Zechariah, do not be afraid. Your prayers have been heard, and your wife Elizabeth is to bear you a son, to whom you shall give the name of John. Joy and gladness shall be yours, and many hearts shall rejoice over his birth, for he is to be high in the Lord's favor. He is to drink neither wine nor strong drink, and from the time when he is yet a child in his mother's womb, he shall be filled with the Holy Spirit. He shall bring back many of the sons of Israel to the Lord their God, ushering in his advent in the spirit and power of Elijah. He shall unite the hearts of all, the fathers with the children, and teach the disobedient the wisdom that makes men just, preparing for the Lord a people fit to receive him. And Zechariah said to the angel, By what sign am I to be assured of this? I am an old man now, and my wife is far advanced in age. Actually, Zechariah was not yet 50, since the ordinary temple priests retired when they reached that age. Numbers chapter 8, verse 25. Luke chapter 1, verse 19. The angel answered, My name is Gabriel, and my place is in God's presence. I have been sent to speak with you, and to bring you this good news. Behold, you shall be dumb and have no power of speech until the day when this is accomplished, and that because you have not believed my promise, which shall be fulfilled in due time. And now all the people were waiting for Zechariah, and wondering that he delayed in the temple so long. But when he came out, he could not say a word to them. Then they knew for sure that he had seen some vision in the sanctuary. He could but stand there making signs to them, for he remained dumb.